Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of the TFC audio project. On this episode of Shop Talk, Mike and I talk about science. We talk about the history of science, why science is important, and we define what science actually means. We talk about some of the limitations of science when it comes to studying humans, and we finish with talking about how anyone can apply scientific principles in their day-to-day life to help them determine good information from bad information. There was a lot to cover, but I hope we conveyed the important points and that you find the information useful. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by TFC Shop, your one-stop shop for natural footwear that doesn't mess up your feet, for foot health accessories, and for balance beams. Our goal with TFC Shop is to only feature products that are well-made, that help you improve your body, and to deliver the best purchase experience possible. We're continually working to improve our customer service as we grow, and we're thankful to anyone that supports TFC with their purchases. Check out tfc-shop.com to check out what we offer. This episode of the audio project is also brought to you by the Roasters Pack. Our team at the TFC head office are big fans of coffee, and this unique Canadian company provides a subscription service that delivers you 3 great coffees to your door each month, and also gives you the story behind each of the craft roasters that the beans come from. You can check out theroasterspack.com and use the code FOOT at checkout for $7 off your first month of any subscription. Subscriptions start at $27 a month, all in, including shipping and taxes, which is less than $1 per cup, so it's actually a really great deal. Lastly, this episode is sponsored by our travel partner, Nanook Protective Hard Cases, which we use to transport electronics to and from our seminars and workshops. They make super high quality cases in Canada that can keep your electronics safe during travel, and you can check out their cases at nanook.com, Nanuk.com. That's it for sponsors, so let's dig into this episode. Hope you enjoy.
It's the TFC audio project.
It's a collective effort. Help people understand their bodies, starting at the feet are the gateway for people to see that there's an issue. You know, a foot conversation is always a whole body conversation. Hey folks, Nick and Mike here, back for another episode of Shop Talk. Today's episode is all about science and the scientific method. We're going to start by defining some terms. We'll talk about the history of science, talk about why science is important, and also some limitations of science in terms of how it's being used today. And we just feel there's science is very important from a conceptual point of view in shaping your thinking and learning new knowledge. But I think a lot of people's perception of science is a little bit skewed. So we want to kind of clear the air. This is an important topic at TFC because it really is one of the guiding principles, or the guiding principle, in how we acquire knowledge that we eventually teach. And there's kind of a series of phases you go through to test it, make sure it's accurate, and we want to go through the elements that are important in kind of the scientific method and how you can apply them, not to do scientific experiments yourself, but perhaps using a more scientific approach to just day-to-day thinking. So let's start by talking about the history of science. And I know you've got a bunch of stuff that you looked up, and I think the history of science is kind of cool because it almost contextualizes why science is so important, is why it first started up. So let's start there.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons for doing this topic was we were talking about this I think it was a few weeks ago, and I don't think that when people talk about science, I don't think they're actually on the same page with what they're actually talking about, a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I think that, and then I realized, where did science come from? And I've learned some of it when you take, every science course you take in university, they'll go through a little bit of a history for that specific topic. So you kind of learn all about the scientific method and all of that. It's always the first chapter in the textbook. But I think going a little deeper, it's where did it come from? And then comparing that to how it is today, and then what people think of it as it is today. So
yeah, because it's veered off the path that it initially was there for, right? It's like anything. You can, if you apply money and you apply incentives to something, then it can often take a weird direction and kind of a weird U-turn and end up somewhere that it wasn't supposed to be. Mm-hmm. And I think with today, with so many people, I think science today is more important than it ever has been before, right? Sure. Because we have so much information available to us. We have this unlimited amounts of information available to us. We have people trying to battle for our attention and tell us things that will grab our attention, right? This whole clickbait or headline problem. And so, everyone needs to have a stronger bullshit detector today than ever before. And I think science gives a really good platform to get people better able at kind of evaluating objectively whether something is true or carries meaning or not. I mean, first of all, if you hear about something scientific on Facebook, it's probably not the full story, right?
No,
So headlines are not a good place to take away, these overarching truths. But we want to arm people with a better understanding of what science is and kind of rescue the definition of science, and also just allow people to use science in their day-to-day lives, because it really is a powerful tool.
So we'll get into some of the definitions later, but I think just a broad, basic definition of it, really what science is the pursuit of knowledge, and that's how it first came about, is that pursuit of knowledge, specifically about the natural world or about the universe. So knowledge about things that are around us.
So trying to make sense of the world, basically.
Exactly. So if you look way back in its history, it's been around for thousands of years. Even in ancient Egypt, there was ways of doing science. The Greeks termed natural philosophy as before science was actually a term, natural philosophy existed for a long period of time. So, and basically, philosophy is the study of fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and experience. So philosophy is an important aspect, and it goes hand in hand with science. And that's actually where science spawned out of. So that kind of continued for a while, this natural philosophy, and natural philosophy is just like knowledge about the natural world. Along the way, there was different thinkers, and there's some prominent figures that people have often heard of, but they don't know kind of what their contributions were. So there was Socrates. Socrates was very important for developing the earliest forms of like critical thinking and debate, and just asking questions and layering questions on top of questions to try to. So if he's in an argument with somebody, he's trying to get to where like there is some, holes in their argument. He was trying to find holes in people's arguments by continuing to ask questions to see like where their logic kind of went off. So this is he also was very important, like I said, critical thinking and skills like that. So
the art of debating is this lost. I always found debating very enticing, right? Like it's fun because it gives you a chance to show you're basically comparing with someone else the logical reasoning method that you use to get to a conclusion. And when you're I think people get in this habit of trying to always defend their position and their ideology, when in reality, it's like, okay, I'm going to compare, I think this is the truth on this topic. You think that's the truth. They're different. Let's really try and dig down and discover the root of where we branch off and disagree, because people focus on superficial crap, right? Or the minutia. And it's like, well, where do we actually disagree?
And what's interesting about that, like as a side note, like logic, like you're saying, in order to form valid arguments, what's interesting is that the content arguments aren't valid by their content; they're valid by their logical form and their structure. So you can actually have a logical argument for something, even if the content is not correct. So those are two different things, but they need to be together, because you can have something that's true, but your argument for it can actually not be of good logical form. So therefore, your way of expressing it is not on point. So logic that brings me to my next thing, is like Aristotle was the first one is kind of coined the person who made logic popular, or kind of not invented it, but made it popular, and it's called Aristotelian logic. But logic is kind of one of those things. It's the study of the form of a valid inference, and we don't want to get too deep into you can go down the rabbit hole just on logic and stuff like that, but it's basically like sound arguments. It's how you form arguments, and that's very foundational in terms of what science is to become too, and it links well with critical thinking and reason. So like reason is around this time too. Philosophers were talking about what is logic, what is reason. Reason's the capacity of consciously making sense of things, so establishing and verifying facts, applying logic, and adjusting beliefs, institutions based on new or existing information. So it's just like, how do we make sense of things using logic and using some of these tools around the time that this stuff was being developed. So this is all stuff that basically started the process of like essentially people thinking deeper about things. They're like, there's like, we want to try to figure out things
and having a system for it.
Exactly. Right? So we need like structures in order to figure things out. We can't just like randomly figure things out. We need structures to put like filters to put these thoughts through, or these experiments through, or
see
these
if they hold up.
questions through, and see if they hold up. So logic, reason, all these. And then if you fast forward to like the 17th century, you were starting to see more actual science. So science as more of like a thing, like an official thing. And that's when it officially became, the pursuit of knowledge. So it kind of got away from the natural philosophy and like science. A scientist was becoming something you did, or there's the term for it. Isaac Newton, 1689. So he invented the kind of classical mechanics or Newtonian mechanics. So we're talking like the origins of physics. So this was the age of the Enlightenment. So basically, scientific societies and these places known as academies, where science was actually done, they started to pop up. So, and again, we're going to fast forward to today, where science is done in these institutions as well.
Yeah.
But you're starting to see places where science was actually done. And
That's
then
where you see like physicists and biologists, all these ists, all these schools of science, basically.
And that really became a thing in like the 19th century, where it was like we started to delineate different branches of science officially, like you say, biology, and like Darwin's Origin of Species was in 1854. So that it kind of like gives you a little time stamp of like, okay, Origin of Species, that was like a huge deal for biology, and evolutionary theory and all of that. And then that's kind of when the scientific method as we know it started to become more mainstream, more in like the 19th century. It was like a real explosion of science. And then you're going to fast forward again into kind of late 19th, early 20th century. And then physics started to really explode. So you've got like Einstein and his theory of relativity and all of that. And that's just very recent in the grand scheme of like humanity, like all the way up to the 1900s. And then continuing through there into the 2000s and to where we are now, it's just continued to like explode. But along the way, I think people have gotten away from what it truly was, and just knowing like science is that pursuit of knowledge about the physical world or the world around us in general.
Yeah.
And there's things like social science, there's different branches of it too. So, but they're still trying to figure out knowledge about the world around us. It's still knowledge of things. So it's our way of trying to organize that. And that is kind of that framework that I think that we need to get back to, and understanding science isn't research. And oftentimes we conflate it with that. It's not necessarily research. It's not necessarily a scientist doing scientisty things in a lab.
Yeah, it's not a dude with test tubes with massive glasses on.
Exactly.
That is an expression of science, a certain expression, but you're right. Like these base principles of just logical, rational ways of thinking about the world and putting them within a framework that are testable with experiments, that are refutable. If what you say or claim is the truth, you're telling that to me, I should be able to essentially prove or disprove whether that holds true based on my framework of putting it through the rigors of, does it apply? Does rational thought confirm that? Does the laws of logic or my base principles of physiology, does that align with your truth? Like we each need to be individual agents of using the method of science at different levels, right?
For sure.
Like not everyone has to be in a lab to apply science. Like when your day-to-day life can be filled with science, and I think you're right. The perception of science is the dude with a test tube or a course you took in high school. But these base principles that essentially underlie the word science are so important, especially today. And that is what we have to kind of get back to. So
like along the way on that thought, there's a study called the philosophy of science. It's a whole other branch, and it actually is like considered, it deals with the foundations of what science is, their implications and all of that. So it's like, their central question is what qualifies as science, and that's the kind of the question we're asking today. Like, what is science, right? And it's been studied along the way, and like you say, falsifiability is one of the central tenets of that. So, can it be proven wrong in general, or if new information comes up, or if new studies come about? Can something be proven wrong? That's just key, because a lot of like dogma or other forms of knowledge that can't be proven wrong in any way, that's essentially defined as like pseudoscience or unscientific, and it can't be truly considered science unless it's falsifiable.
And that was kind of where that was almost like an initial impetus for science, is like, if you're the king and you say something and you say that that's the truth, Well, you have a lot of power, and that's not, it removes the ability of people to be independent thinkers. So, I feel like
Exactly.
initially science was a defense against claims based on political or religious dogma, appeals to tradition, quote unquote common sense, or just currently held beliefs, right? Like if something is a commonly held belief until something comes out to disprove that. Like you talked
Exactly.
about the black swan, right? We always thought swans were white. Everywhere that you went, swans were always white. So it was easy to say swans are white. That is the truth, right? Until proven otherwise. Then someone sees a black swan. Well, all of a sudden that previous truth goes to shit because now there's new evidence showing that there now are also black swans. So science was basically developed as a reliable way to demonstrate truth beyond just appeal to authority or believing what someone in power says is the truth.
That's
important.
because it allows us to kind of almost protect ourselves from being from others putting their thoughts and their agendas and their beliefs on top of us without, it allows us to have a tool to say, okay, well, let's apply this tool to it, and let's see if what you're saying is actually true, or if we can start to uncover if it's true. Because a lot of science is a work in progress. It's like, and we'll get into that. It's not one study is never going to prove or disprove something, because again, another study can come out to disprove what that study proved.
Yeah.
But it allows us to at least say, okay, let's just continue this open conversation, so we can try to objectively look at reality as opposed to just go with what this guy is saying, right? So I think that's huge, and along with that philosophy of science, a big component of that is this trial and error. And this guy called Karl Popper was one of these famous philosophers of science, but he was saying trial and error is really, again, one of those things at the roots of what science is. So it's a fundamental method of problem solving, but it's basically just to manipulate variables until a result is reached or not reached.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what you're doing in science. And like base principles and first principles are very important to apply to the scientific method, because it can become so complex with modern tools of measurement, modern statistical analysis. It gets so jumbled up and complex, but it's like, let's just apply like fundamentals, logic, reason, first principles, thinking, trial and error, tinkering.
We all do trial and error. We do trial and error literally when we're babies, right? Like movement, the way to discover movement, how to move, how to walk, how to crawl, how to support your own pumpkin, like your own head, is all through trial and error. You try a strategy, it either works. If you fall on your face, that was not a good strategy, or
if you try it multiple times and the same thing happens, you're going to discard that.
Exactly.
And then if you try a good strategy for multiple times and it's reproducible, you're going to continue to use that, and then you're going to refine it over time, and you're going to develop kind of a schema for how that thing that you're studying works.
The brain is a
time.
trial and error processing machine. It's the most complex computer ever, and we inherently do trial and error, but we don't really think of it as trial and error or as experimentation, but we do it. And it's more just connecting with the fact that is underlying science, is just trying something, seeing what the result was. Was that result you intended for? No? Well, let's try something else.
Yeah.
And that's really, like, fundamentally, as physical therapists, when we treat someone, it is trial and error. It is an educated trial and error program where this is the problem, this is what I think is going to help you, let's try that, and if it doesn't work, next time we'll do something different. It's trial and error at its core.
And we're informed by a bunch of other things we've learned before that period of time. We're informed by studies before that time, by personal experiences, by clinical experiences before that time,
seeing patterns
before that time. But when it comes down to dealing with a human who is a complex system, then you really have to apply these. You have to look beneath. You got to almost say, like, okay, here's what people think of as science. Here's the research and all of that. I'm gonna have that in my brain, in the back of my head. But I'm dealing with a complex system that may not follow these single variant studies that come out, and there might be one of the thousands or millions of confounding variables might be applicable here. Their psychology might be a factor here. So all of these confounding variables have to be applied in addition to using what we think of as science in order to treat somebody. That's where there's a delineation between science, what a lot of people think of, which is like conflating science with research. And I think that's a big problem, is that they're two different things. Research is a way that science is done, and it's kind of an agreed upon way, for better or for worse, of how science should be done these days.
And in fact, a lot of research is actually very poor science.
Very
when you
true.
actually dig into it and learn. And I think that's,
Exactly.
we'll get into that in terms of, in order to preach the result of a research study as truth or as valid or as applicable, there should be this prerequisite that you should have to understand how to evaluate the methodology and also apply rationality and sound first principles to that study to determine whether or not it even can apply in terms of like whatever the results were, whether those can apply to yourself or to other people. And a lot of times those research studies don't really pass that filter very well if you actually know what to look for and what to evaluate. And it's complex.
So I think the problem lies in that once people see a research paper, they think that it's almost this like worship of science. So the average person will just take that as true.
Yeah.
And like you said, they haven't shot it through this rigorous filter of logic, reason, critical thinking, first principle, all that. Which once going through that, that's a very it's a filter that actually will keep most things in the filter, right? So the things that come out the other side of that are very small.
And everyone's got their own filter, right? Some people's filter is just like it's just like a tube that things shoot through. Other people's filter is like a multi-step process that filters through all these different caveats for detecting bullshit.
Yeah.
And the more robust your filter is, the better idea the more you can get towards the truth, right?
And guess what? The filter and the filter is the science.
Yes.
People think the research
Yes,
is the
that's a good
filter is
point.
the science. And it's probably the biggest part of the science. The research is one part of it, but I think that
But the research still has to go through the filter.
It has to go through the filter, and most people don't have a filter for it to go through.
Yeah.
Even scientists or even people in specific fields don't have that filter for it to go through, and they're not applying the filter well. So, and the filter is the hardest thing to develop, and that kind of goes to all of these base back to the history. It's like this is where it all came from. This is where people are trying to think of like, how can we analyze the world with all of these tools of logic, reason, and all of that? That's the foundation of it all, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where people have struggle with is that there's, I think just, like you say, building the filter, that's important.
And there's things that like, if you're being paid to prove something, maybe it's in your interest subconsciously or consciously to make that filter a little bit more loosey-goosey, right? So that you can push something through the filter and claim that you put it through the filter and get the result that you're guessing is, if you make your prediction, if you want to meet that prediction inherently, maybe your filter isn't as robust as it would be if you were being objective and didn't have a personal connection to that question. And we'll talk about that when we talk about research. And
then I think, like, to your point, as a consumer of that knowledge or research, it's important for you to apply that as one of the many filters is like who paid for this study, right? And where did it come from? And what are some possible reasons why this study was done? Is there biases present? These are all things that, like you say, we'll get to. You want to jump into the scientific method and what that is?
Yeah, and I think one last thing to say there to kind of wrap up that intro is just science is a tool. And tools are, how well you know how to use the tool determines whether that tool is used for good or bad, right? Like if you have a drill, you can use that drill to build something. Or you can use that drill to drill through your foot, and that's not a good idea to do. But if you don't know how to use the equipment, you can hurt yourself. If you don't know, science is a tool. If you don't know how to apply the method of science, then you're not going to end up with a very good result. So it's a tool, and it can be used or misused. And oftentimes, the people who you think are using science appropriately, these people that are literally paid to be scientists, sometimes don't abide by using the tool of science appropriately. Whether it's because there's other incentives at play or whatever the case may be. And
that's important because I think these days science as a tool is being grossly abused.
Yes,
it's unfortunate because it's such an important tool that it's being, and that's. It's just something that we need to look deeper in because it's just swaying the reality and convention and the way things are done and laws, and it's swaying all of these things. It's swaying our health, and it's because a lot of it is because of the abuse of it, not because of science, because underlying it's like one of the most important tools that's ever been established as humans, and I think a big part of why we are who we are today. So,
and really being able to apply science well just means you're a good thinker.
Yes.
Right? And that's one thing we always talk about this, how people people's ability to think deeply about topics, or, you know, go deeper than just the superficial level of saying, oh, you know, a fact or something like that. People aren't very good thinkers anymore. Like, you even debate with people or have conversations, right? The conversation can be, it's not, you can have a heated conversation about something and it not be an argument, right? It's not confrontational. It's a you know,
The Socratic method, basically.
it's a passionate application of determining who's using a better method to obtain that truth. And I think a lot of
You're
people
trying to find holes, right?
we're not teaching people how to be good thinkers anymore.
No.
We're teaching them how to be shittier thinkers, because we're, you know, things come up on Facebook or things come up on the internet that are trying to vie for your attention, and it's confusing people, and they have no tool to filter through the good information from the bad information. So this is a very, you know, I think
unfortunately too, like, emotion is a roadblock for like the methods that we're talking about, of like critical thinking and science
and cognitive dissonance. If you've done something a certain way for your whole life, and now you know, number one, you're probably not looking for evidence to disprove the way you think about it. But number two, if you do see that, you're probably just going to discount the fact that that could be applicable. And so you need something that puts it through that rigorous filter to really, that's your objective way of determining whether it's valid or not. And people need to understand, even at a base level, how to apply those filters. So,
and it's hard, but that's the pursuit. That's the initial pursuit. It's the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah.
So as a human, I think it's just a really, you can have your own pursuit. You can personalize science to you and try to find out what is true about the universe, and go on your own path and use the things of what other people have discovered along the way, but then again apply it through your own filter. That's kind of it's a cool way of looking at it, is that you have your own pursuit of the truth. And the more objective you are, like, it's all about, like, there's no point in lying to yourself. Like, it's all about trying to, like, why would you do that? Right. So you might as well try to find out the actual truth. That this weird thing where we want to, like, I think a lot of people are just not trying to find the actual truth, or once they get set on it, once they find a truth that agrees with them or their motives.
It's easy to accept something that you agree with, or that you currently accept, as it's easy to look for confirmation of your own existing truth, and it's hard to constantly challenge your truths.
Yeah.
Which essentially is a way to build up and make those truths stronger, right? You should always, I always tell people with the Footner program, the goal is to always try and have conversations with the smartest people that disagree with the way we're doing things, because that is the best opportunity to learn as to whether or not your way of thinking of things or your method holds up in the stadium of discussion, right? In the stadium of defending things using the methods of science and rational thinking. So let's get into what did you want to get into next?
I'm just gonna. The scientific method is something. It's kind of it's newer, so it's in the 19th century. Basically seeks to objectively explain events in nature in a reproducible way. So the scientific method can be broken down into, like, experimental design and things like that. But you're essentially trying to have more of a structure to finding things out. And you're trying to, the key word here in this all is reproducible. And that's one of the talking points that we'll discuss, is that a lot of science is often not reproducible, meaning if multiple people did the same experiment, would they come to the same conclusion or not? And I think that's huge, because there's random chance, there's confounding variables, there's complex systems, there's all of these things that can actually give you a result, but when the next person does it, it's not the same. Or, you know, so that's kind of one of the many factors that needs to be considered when you're trying to find an actual truth about the universe, or what we would sometimes call a scientific theory, which is, okay, a theory is established once multiple studies or multiple experiments come to a very similar conclusion. Then we can kind of be more confident in saying, okay, like, the same thing's coming out all the time. This must be, you know, it's not going to be the absolute truth, because maybe in future something that we've never even, maybe we didn't even have a tool that could measure what we would try to measure.
Theories are still fluid.
Everything
always
about science
open
is
to
fluid.
be proven wrong.
That's the very interesting part about science, is that it's forever changing, and all sciences we know it right now could technically be misguided or I don't want to say wrong, but what's interesting is that we keep uncovering, like, different layers to things, and that's kind of very confusing too. So it's like there's this interesting example of, like, building muscle. So this was used in the book Anti-Fragility, but Nassim Taleb, he said, okay, so we've known for forever that like if you lift heavy things, the more, if you're a manual laborer, or if you, even since the advent of like weightlifting, if you lift heavy things, your muscles grow and you get stronger.
Yeah.
So, but then we try to apply that through the scientific method, and we say, okay, well, we want to know why is that. But we can't forget the initial thing is we already know the truth that when we lift heavy things, we get stronger over time.
Mm-hmm.
So for one period of time, we thought it was, the tearing of muscle fibers and the regrowth of that muscle fibers. And then we started to think, see that, okay, there's also hormonal, deeper than that, there's hormonal factors that when you lift heavy things, hormones are released. And is that getting you stronger? There's the nervous system. So it's like, we're always uncovering, we might find out there's a new thing of why we're getting stronger, and we're always fighting and debating why are we getting stronger. But the baseline thing is if you lift heavy things, you get stronger. Mm-hmm. So I think this is all like first principles thinking, is like we can't confuse ourselves just because we don't know the actual mechanism behind things.
Yeah.
And that is very common these days. We're like, hey, like foam rolling, like for instance in our field, it's like foam rolling, it doesn't do this, it does this and this and this. It's like, okay, well, wait a minute, like let's discuss, like, if we have a question, does it work for this thing? Does it get to the goal we're trying to accomplish? If the answer is yes, we can debate all we want about what is it actually doing. But if it's like quote unquote working and getting the result,
is it accomplishing the goal?
Then okay, we can still use it, even though. So that begs the question: can we use something, or should we use something if we know it works but we don't know the mechanism? And a lot of people on the internet seem to think that we need to know the mechanism of behind something in order to use the thing, right?
This is, oh my God, you see this all the time. The few times that I read comments, it's like you'll say, if you spend less time sitting in a chair with your hip at 90 degrees, you're less likely to get stuck in hip flexion. Like you will improve your hip extension by just spending less time in hip flexion. People are like, where's the study, bro? Show me a study.
Yes.
It's like, well, do you really need a study to tell you that, like first principles, if you put a joint in a certain position for long periods of time, it starts to get stiff in that position. Can we agree on that?
If you put a cast on your arm for 6 weeks and you take it off, is the joint very stiff and are the muscles around it stiff?
Exactly. Like we really need to pare back down to first principles, and like a joint that doesn't get moved gets stiff, a muscle that gets loaded gets stronger, a muscle that doesn't get loaded it atrophies and gets weaker. Like if we can agree on these
moving
things,
more is better,
then it's really not that hard to extrapolate to, wearing shoes that don't let your feet articulate and move will make your foot stiff. Wearing shoes that support the arch of your foot will make your foot weak. Like these are base principles. We have to just be mindful of this.
And I think that I think that's an attempt to go against the kind of the polar opposite of that. It would be like making profound claims on something, right? So making profound claims on a topic and saying, and then people asking, what. I think people just want to know, like, where does it come from, right? So, but the problem there is that people, like, it's not always going to be in the form of a perfectly laid out study on that subject, because that doesn't exist. Most studies on most things aren't there. So, and most studies are univariate. So it's like they'll study one small topic, but it won't give an argument for the larger topic that we're talking about. So it's like there's no study that says that. There's these 5 studies that show this, there's this study that shows that, there's this study that shows that. So we can use these studies to make, again, a logical argument if we apply critical thinking skills to it, and therefore that can lead us to us saying that this is true and this has something to it because of these other studies and this other research that's done in the past. But there's no one magical study that shows everything. It's like
and guess what? Shit is not black and white. It's not this or this, because guess what? Context makes a massive difference. And you can have 20 studies showing that, people that do this get this result. But guess what? If you apply that to yourself and you're not living the same life or have the same history of your body, of the people whose bodies were used for that study, it might not apply to you. It's complex. It depends, right? And the only way to evaluate whether those studies can give you advice that's useful to you is to try it.
So I think that let's talk about that, because that's a good talking point that I had, is the complex systems problem with science. Humans being basically the most complex system we know of. So if you're trying to study a complex system like a human, the amount of confounding variables that will be present, that are possible to be present, is just astronomical. And if you are trying to really pare down and isolate certain variables, you there's some sense of impossibility to isolate variables when you're studying a human. It's just especially when you're studying like their health, for instance.
Well, let's talk about like experimental design. So when you design an experiment, you're trying to isolate variables, right? In order to find out what effect one variable has, you have to isolate variables. And humans are super complex machines with many interdependent systems and multiple variables at play at all times. So if you try and discover a truth when it comes to the human body by isolating all these other variables to just focus on one single variable, well, guess what? Whatever truth, whatever conclusion you end up with is not going to be a very broad applying conclusion, because that's only one tiny snippet. That's 1% of the information when it comes to how the body functions. And so that has to be considered.
For sure.
Right? Like science on humans must be taken with a grain of salt, because it, by nature of how you design experiments, it cannot tell you big overarching truths.
And I would argue that there's a lot of, I think that is the art of science, is that like, how can we beautifully design? It's the art and the technical aspect of it too, because that being said, certain experiments can be designed way better, and you could almost look at it and be like, oh my god, they covered for a lot of things, and I can take this more seriously than this study that they were way off. Like a few things, basically like sample size, like things like sample size, the methods that they used, so the variables that they were accounting for or adjusting for, the study design, how the study was designed, tracked, how stats were used on it, the interventions used, the confounding factors, and how they were adjusted for. So I think that a good scientist will try their best to objectively create an experiment or design an experiment that tries to adjust for as many of these as we can. And then we would, looking at these research methods, it's up to us to say, okay, did this person do their due diligence to try at least to cover as many of these confounding variables as possible?
Yeah.
Or was it just complete shit show? Which many studies, if you look, just like peer at the methods, and you'll immediately see like, oh, like we can almost discard this right away because of these methods are, and unfortunately most people don't know how to look at methods and critically analyze methods of studies,
including me. Like we know more than, we literally took a course in physio school about research study methodology, so that, you know, this whole thing about evidence-based practice and making sure that you're practicing according to the best available evidence at that time requires you to be able to evaluate research studies. And I really think there should be this rule where if you are not allowed to quote or mention a research study unless you've, number one, read the study as a whole fully from start to finish. I'm not talking, like most people read the abstract, they're like, oh, that's interesting. They read the results. Okay, that's the truth. Like this study showed this.
Yes.
It's like, okay, did you read the methodology? Did you read through their experimental design to make sure that the sample size was big enough, the variables that they measured were accurate, the audience that they, the actual study subjects are close enough and related enough to the people that you're trying to extrapolate these results to? Like this is a very deep process, and you should
what
not.
About all the other studies? What about that word reproducible? Is there anything else that?
What other studies show the same thing? But you should not be allowed to quote a study as the results being true. And preaching it as the truth, unless you've done your due diligence to examine how that research was done, what other studies have shown, are there any other studies to disprove what that thing proves? Like, there is a much deeper requirement than what people are using right now. In fact, people don't even look at the conclusion anymore. All they do is read a headline on Facebook and then preach it as the truth.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I saw a research study showed bacon causes cancer. It's
and
like,
not only that,
well, I don't know about that.
So the underlying study wasn't looked at, but then you've also got the media company who's actually just completely butchered the actual. So it's like two
completely
layers
out of context.
Two layers of butchery, and I think that's, and that brings me to like the cherry picking problem. So a lot of people, on your point, is that a lot of people will want to prove they have an agenda to prove, or they have a point to prove. So the fact that we worship science these days, it makes it so that they'll pick a study and they'll say, aha, I got you, because this study says this. And you see this all the time, and then it's just like this like fight of studies. But then what's interesting is that you'll see another person come back and be like, well, this study shows the exact opposite of that. And then it's like, but it's like, okay, what we're seeing here is that really we don't know yet, because there's two different studies that are showing two. So you can cherry pick all of these studies to your liking, and you can try to form an argument. And hey, I think everybody's guilty for this, because any paper that you do or any book that you write or any sort of like argument that you're trying to back up with science, you are consciously or even subconsciously cherry picking research that's going to best inform you. And sometimes it can be done in a tasteful way, in a way that's respectable, because again, you're honestly trying to find research that. But I think you just got to do your due diligence just to look at the stuff that, like you say, doesn't go with your point of view, and also kind of give that the airtime, so it's not just the few studies that might. It's very.
And you have to be open to criticism. Like if you do a research study and you put it out into the world, and people, I went to this footwear biomechanics symposium, and people are presenting their research. They have 10-minute slots, so you present your research for 8 minutes, the abstract, the conclusion, the methods, blah, 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 and then you have 2 minutes where people go up to microphones and fire questions at you. Well, what about this variable, or how did you measure this, or could there be, like you're basically if you do research, put it out to the world to try and describe some sort of truth. You have to be open to people criticizing your methods and look at it not as something that you need to defend, something that you need to say, well, yes, I considered it in this way, or I eliminated that variable in this way. And you're basically, every single person that asks you a question and criticizes the way you did your research is a opportunity to either learn how you can do that research better next time, or to build a more robust case that your research is actually accurate.
Which is essentially what the peer review process should be. And there's journals that are more renowned than others, but I think that we also got to take a serious look at, because there's, like, I've seen that on Joe Rogan's podcast, there was these guys who were actually submitting studies to papers, and they were getting published, and there was complete nonsense in these papers.
One was about how pigs could fly, and they paid enough money, and a reputable journal published their article as science. This is part of the problem when money gets involved. And
that's that's an extreme example, but these guys actually got in trouble for submitting these completely false studies. And what you're finding is like, so what we thought of as, like, again, the problem of worshiping science, we thought that was like the absolute truth. And what came out of these, because it was published in some sort of paper we call a scientific paper, it's the truth, right? Yeah. But wait a minute, not necessarily. It could be complete garbage. It could be partial garbage, or it could be very misinformed. It could be temporarily right, but then disproven wrong. Yeah. We don't know. And then money enters the mix. So now
who's funding the study?
Who's funding the study? Who's the gatekeepers of these journals that studies are published in? And then that begs the question too, is like, to be taken seriously, something that you have to be published in a major journal or a renowned journal. So does that really limit how science is done? Now we have these gatekeepers of science, and it's like, oh shit, there's these few gatekeepers, and like, you have to go through us now.
With alternative motives, as we saw with that thing where they paid to publish bullshit.
And I would argue that, like, the more renowned ones are probably more stringent than that, but at the same time, it's like we're putting a limit on science or research because of that as well. So that kind of makes it, that almost puts like a governor on science, where very, very important, because I think that fundamental principles and studies should be applied through this like stringent peer review process. However, it doesn't mean that you can't apply these scientific principles, do other forms of research in science on a smaller scale that doesn't have to be put through these institutions, right?
Exactly.
So,
well, you talked about clinical science, like this database of information that you have in your brain of, 1,000 people that you've treated over the course of your career, and you've seen, and like realistically, it's a lot of the same pattern, right? People all have the same problems. They sit all day, they don't move. So they've been, a lot of the patterns you see are very repetitive. And if you apply an intervention with someone and help someone fix themselves in a certain way, and it works, and then you apply it on the next patient you see that pattern with, if you do that 50 times and you see a positive result in every single one of those people, that is a powerful database of clinical science that is not published in a journal, that is not formalized with experimental design and all this kind of stuff. It is a N of 50 research study that you have done and tried to refine over time to get to the best intervention to treat or to get rid of this issue.
Exactly.
And I think people underestimate that as a source of science, right? And
is it reproducible? Well, you could argue that
you're reproducing it every time.
for you. It's reproducible. and maybe for people that you teach. And then the other part of that, it gets so complex because you're actually probably better at dealing with a lot of these other, let's say a study is published. It's like random people who are doing the intervening. They're putting people through. So you have your own way of doing things too. So I think you're adjusting for, personally as a clinician, adjusting for many of these even subconscious confounding variables in terms of like, oh, I've seen, it's all pattern recognition, right? So, oh, I've seen this type of person before. You're putting it through this kind of broad experiential, filter, basically. Right? And that's important because it's like, oh, it might be a psychological thing that I'm going to say something different, because if I just looked at a research study, it wouldn't say that, hey, if this type of person comes in, you need to say things this way instead of that way.
Yeah.
Instead, because no, it's just like, hey, do screen A on person test. It's so simplified, but it's like, no. I'm going to treat this person differently because I see these things that I've seen hundreds and thousands of times, and I think it's going to work if I say it this way, not that way. So these are very nuanced things that I think are very important. So that's where it gets complex, but we can't discard or discount that out of it.
Personal experience is important. And, back to this whole thing of evidence-based practice, the problem there is, if you let's look at drug companies are notorious for this. So cherry picking results or cherry picking studies. So a drug company wants to get drug A passed. They have to prove that it's better than placebo. So they'll do 50 studies. If 48 of those studies say that drug is not only not better than placebo, but it actually messes you up royally. But 2 of those studies show that the drug, based on the experimental design, they found a way to show that drug is better than placebo. They can put 48 of those studies in a drawer, lock it up, no one ever sees it. They can publish the 2 studies that prove that it was effective. And guess what? They can cherry pick the results to show that this drug is better than placebo, and then the drug gets passed. And 48 of 50 studies showed that not only was it not effective, it actually harms people, but no one ever hears about that. This is where the cherry picking and the essentially being really choosy in the interest of what you're trying to prove or sell can really make this a muddy space, because no one sees that, but it is happening, and it happens so much it'll make your brain explode. It's money.
So
exactly.
So once money gets into it, now this amazing tool we have is now getting just abused for many different reasons, money being probably the main one. I would say that's the biggest thing that's actually making it a muddy area. And like you say, it's like we can throw out studies that don't agree with what we're trying to prove. We can also manipulate statistics and statistical analysis. Unless you're a statistician, it's like
that's a weird space.
It's like, okay, I can put it through the filter of statistics and make it show something, and this term statistically significant. It's like, okay, well, we just take it as is. A lot of us are like, hey, it's statistically significant. So what does that mean? And when you find out things like placebo are often almost as good in studies as the actual drug itself, you're like, okay, well, what does that even mean? Because a placebo pill almost did as good as your drug. So what are we talking about here?
Yeah, and a placebo does not have side effects that include death and constipation and a long list. And I think this brings us to the next point. It's not to say, with that said, there are limitations of science. That is one of them, being able to cherry pick results and only publish results that prove whatever you're trying to prove. But it's not to say that science needs to be thrown out altogether, because it is unbelievably important. And I think it just has to be used optimally. And, part of this is everything should be taken, even something that's gone through a rigorous filter of science, with a moderate dose of skepticism. And I think, what is skepticism? It's not just believing something that someone tells you. As, someone really smart, a university professor, if they tell you something, I'm not saying you should just try and prove it wrong, but you should always have this moderate dose of skepticism where it's like, okay, that makes logical sense. Through my filter of experience, I think that kind of does make rational sense. I'm going to try and make sure that that's actually the truth. So I'm going to look into it myself, whether I try it on my own body.
Or ask them questions.
Whether I do some research. Yeah, ask them questions about how they got to that conclusion. This moderate dose of skepticism is very important. And no one is we should be more skeptic now than ever before.
Yeah.
Not so much to the point where it paralyzes us, but also it needs to be something where I never accept anything as the truth until I prove it to myself.
For sure.
And proving it to yourself depends on the degree of rigor that you apply to knowledge before you say, okay, this is legit. And the beauty about health is that you have a study subject available to you at all times that can be honest if you're honest with yourself, and that's your own body, right? If someone says, oh, doing this will improve your ankle mobility, well, guess what? You can call bullshit until it's actually true, and you can prove it on yourself. If you have an ankle mobility restriction, you do what that person says. Did it work or not? If it didn't, it doesn't mean it was completely wrong, but it tells you, like, you have a way to prove it to yourself. Prove shit to yourself. And in the world of health, it's very powerful.
Things like diet too, use these principles of tinkering and trial and error on yourself, because as we know, like, not every diet is good for everybody. And even though there's handfuls of studies that say, oh, you know, the ketogenic diet is good, or this other diet is good, it's like, okay, well, it still might not be best for you. So you just need to apply these scientific methods, these base layers that we talked about at the beginning, to it on yourself. And again, because really, it's like, what if, as a thought experiment, let's say that there was like studies came out and they're like, this is the way we need to eat, but every time you ate that way, you like shit your pants, right? it's like, okay, well, even though there's a lot of science on it, I shit my pants every time. So when I don't eat that thing, I don't, and I feel a lot better. Oh, okay, well, even though all of science says this, I'm still not going to do this because for me, I don't feel the best. Exactly. So I think that's also important to consider, is that because we're so complex, it really has to be individualized as well, but it can be well informed by all the other studies at the same time.
I think one of the biggest areas, one of the biggest pillars of health where the method of science has been butchered and just beaten to a pulp is the world of food, is the world of nutrition, right? And it's like, you can prove that, like, there's so many like, there should not be these transitional fads in what we eat every friggin' 20 years. This is the craziest thing ever. It shows you that science knows nothing about food, basically. Yeah. Right? If they say, oh, fat is good. No, wait, fat is bad. Oh, wait, no, salt is good. No, salt is bad. It's like, make up your friggin' mind. You don't know. So stop putting these things out there. And the problem is that whatever they want to prove, or whatever science they want to put out there, if they say, oh, fiber is good, well, guess what? Every food that's not real food, it's engineered food, can now say high fiber on the box. And if that's the trend in quote unquote science, people think that that's a good thing to eat, when in reality it's not real food, and it's not going to give you the nutrients you need to actually function as a human. So I think it's really made it so complex, and I just made it such muddy waters in something so fundamental as what you need to put in your mouth. That's the biggest reason we're starting to get into food now, because it's a bad space. Back
to the logic, critical thinking, and first principles. It's like, what did our human ancestors eat? Yeah. So a lot of people are looking at
ancestral knowledge is powerful.
Yeah, it's just, okay, here's what we have generally eaten for over time, and then applying the N=1 part of it to, here's how I feel good when I eat this, because I know that my ancestors probably ate this, and I know that there's also some good studies. You almost have to take it all and then apply it to you. And I think it's just like you say, muddy water by nature of just trying to study humans again.
And it's almost like science has gotten in the way of us just really thinking of, like, we never used to need experts to tell us what to eat. We're probably supposed to eat things that either grew in the ground or run around before they're killed. Let's just bring it back to, okay, is this artificially made in a factory, or is this something that would have occurred naturally 1,000 years ago?
Very true.
Like, that's a really easy filter to put your food choices through. That doesn't work. That is the application of science, but it does not involve you needing to read research paper or consult a quote unquote food expert to tell you what is good for you to put in your mouth.
And it's the same thing of, like, we don't necessarily need, it's this, like, wanting to have a mechanism for why this is good. It's like, this thing to eat is good because it does this at a cellular level, and it helps mitochondria do this and this and this. And it's like, okay, well, cool. Again, the weightlifting example, but we've always known that this food is good. So we don't necessarily need to know that. Or if there's a study that said, oh, it might be doing this to her instead of that, and then people are like, oh, it's not doing that. But again, that's confusion for the average person. It's like, hey, this food makes me feel good, so I eat it.
And there's a lot of variables even in food. It's like, okay, you want to do a test and see if this certain vegetable is good for you. Well, are you talking about the chemicals that we put on that vegetable now to be able to grow it in nutrient-poor soil? Like, there's so many variables where you can just cherry pick and say, oh, if you eat broccoli, it makes you sick. It's like, okay, well, is it the broccoli making you sick? Because we've eaten broccoli for a long time. Or is it the chemicals we now put on the broccoli, or the way we've engineered that strain of broccoli in modern society?
And then what else are you eating?
Yeah,
and like, it's like, how much of it are you eating? When are you eating?
Exactly.
What other things are you doing in your life? Because what you eat, even simple factors are like if you're a stressed individual, your digestive system is not going to function the same as somebody who's not a, and I'm talking like if you're an overstressed individual and in sympathetic state all the time, and you're not in rest or digest mode, you're not going to process food. And this
I'm learning that now, and it's blowing my mind because you're right. If you're driving in a car from one meeting to the next, you're stressed to the tits because you're late for the next meeting. You're driving a metal machine that automatically puts you in this heightened state of stress, and then you're shoving non-nutrient dense food in your mouth. Do you really think that food is going to get absorbed adequately? No.
Exactly. Or maybe you are eating quote unquote healthy food, but you work in a cubicle and your boss yells at you every day when you're eating lunch, and you sleep for 2 hours a night, and you're going through a divorce. So maybe the diet is not the thing that's causing you to have digestive issues. So again, it's just human. It's humans. So it's tough, but
you have to. But it's back to this whole. It's trying to because this podcast is a hard topic to talk about because it goes so deep, right? And you don't want to lose people by talking about something really conceptually when really we're trying to give people actionable advice. And I think a big thing there is just be honest with yourself and experiment with yourself. Control variables. If science is about controlling variables, well, if you want to determine whether your acne is because of stress or is because of the food you're eating, pick one of the variables, modify it, get it under control, and then you isolate for the other one, right? If you're eating really clean food, real food, and your acne is still there, maybe it's due to the stressors in your life, right? Like stressful interactions that you have at work, or maybe it's because of sleep. And as long as people know the variables that they can modify and how they can modify them to put them in an optimal state, then they have all the tools they need to be able to do science on their own bodies and determine what is best for them to be healthy.
You can be running multiple experiments.
That's what we need to give people.
Yeah. So you can actually, what we're trying to say is that the whole point of this is that we need to, I think, first of all, agree on what science is at a baseline level. Mm-hmm. And then I think we need to, instead of looking at just science as research, looking at scientific thinking and principles as things that we can all apply to our own lives. So if we apply these fundamental principles, we can be running, like you say, an experiment or even multiple experiments. We can be running social experiments in our own lives. We can be running diet experiments. We can be running exercise experiments. We can be running all of these experiments even simultaneously and trying to, like I say, adjusting little things like, oh, if I wake up and I go for a walk every day for 6 weeks, oh, I'm feeling better. That's an experiment, and again, it might not be put through the rigor of what we call like the peer review process, but it's something. It is truth because it's personal truth for you at that time. Mm-hmm. So I think that we all need to be better at applying it and not leaving it. It's almost like we leave science to the scientists, and it's like, oh shit, whatever the scientists say, I'm going to do. Yeah, and then you're
basically saying you're shipping
the truth.
You're sending off other people. Your thinking process to other people. That's a dangerous thing to do, right? Don't outsource your thinking. Understand a rational and sound thinking method and apply it in your day-to-day life at whatever level makes sense for you or will benefit you. Another thing I want to talk about is we talked about this correlation versus causation.
Yes,
because I think they get mixed up a lot. And I Greg Rose, shout out to Greg Rose. He's just a super smart dude. He's part of the Functional Movement Screen team, Titleist Performance Institute. He talked, I think it was last year, Perform Better. He said, did you know that people commit more robbery when ice cream is served, people commit more robberies? So it's like, okay, well, when ice cream is served, the rate of ice cream being served and the rate of robberies go up together. That must mean that when people eat ice cream, they're more likely to commit robbery. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, no, those both occur highest in the summer. So during the summer months, people are more likely to rob people because it's not freezing cold. You know, think of Canada. And also during the summer, we serve ice cream. It doesn't mean eating ice cream makes people rob people. That's a correlation. That's not a causation.
Yeah.
And so we really need to, that is a hard one to isolate. And I think it doesn't get isolated enough. What people say is causation is really just correlation.
That is like, exactly. That's like a very easy example to see it. And I think this problem goes really deep because as humans we want to find we love causation. Yes. We love to think this causes that, but
because it lets us make sense of the world, which is all we're trying to do.
Exactly. When you listen to a lot of the best like philosophers in the world, even to present time, they will tell you that even the things that we are pretty sure are causation because they've been put through in scientific rigor are still just correlation.
Yeah.
It's very like some thinkers out there think it's almost impossible to get causation. It's very, very hard to
when
isolate.
it comes to human.
When it comes to humans and a bunch of other things too. I mean,
It makes sense.
it's
when you
but
understand
again, that's one of those things. I think it's just something interesting to note. But at a baseline level, just thinking about the correlation versus causation thing in your own life, because we can be tricked in a lot of cases, and I think that's science as a profession needs to be better at that too when studying humans.
Yeah. So in terms of, let's kind of bring it back and kind of wrap it up. So
Yeah.
I think one thing that the Folk Collective is going to aim to do, like we've put it in terms of like a code that part of the revenue that gets generated from Foot Nerds giving seminars and workshops is dedicated to a TFC research fund. And that research fund, you know, you look at research studies, you're thinking, okay, well, who's funding these studies? Because the reality is that a really rigorous, elegant study takes money to do. Someone has to run the stats, someone has to collect the data, all that kind of stuff. I think in terms of the data collection, we want to create features within the app that allow people to essentially, you know, if you got tight ankles, we want to put an ankle algorithm within the app, and it's free, and it basically lets you get instructions stepwise of these are variables that you can work on to improve your ankle mobility. And after you work, you know, try this and then measure your ankle mobility and see if it changed. And essentially what it does is it gives us this massive pool of anonymous data to say this intervention gave this result. This intervention gave this result. So we have this massive data collection tool that we, you know, that's anonymous that can help with that. But then the other part is, okay, we have all this data. Let's pay people to objectively look at this data and analyze it and see what it comes up with. And I think having a research fund from a health education company that has no ulterior motive improving something, we just want to find the truth, is going to be a very powerful way to fund research when this thing scales and more revenues coming in, because it allows us to do unbiased research. It allows us to go to Irene Davis or Daniel Lieberman, very smart people in the world of science, and say, what research do you think is most powerful to do based on the problems that you see? And how can we design an experiment that allows us to do objective research and rigorous science to determine whether that's the truth or not, or whether that's appropriate to recommend to people or not. So I'm super excited for when that becomes a reality, because I think data collection is one of the big, very expensive things to do. And if you can give someone a free platform where they can access education, but can also mark their progress anonymously, and that gives you pieces of data, that's very powerful.
Yeah, because it has to be like empirical evidence is like changes you can see with your own eyes, basically, and measure over time.
And you have to teach people, obviously, how to very reliably and accurately measure their ankle range of motion, for example, to determine a change. And but it allows you to get like sample sizes in the thousands without requiring everyone to come to one specific spot. You can basically decentralize data collection. And obviously there's going to be some error, people that don't measure it properly. But overall, if you have a 10,000 person sample size and you've done a really good job of expressing this is how you need to measure it to get an accurate screen every time you check your ankle range, I think we can do something pretty special to basically create an algorithm to say, okay, try these things. This has worked for a lot of people in the past. And if we tweak that algorithm very slightly, how does that change either the rate of progress or the amount of progress that people are getting for a variable like, for example, ankle range of motion or balance? Or we can apply that to anything, right? Back pain, whatever. But you can kind of put together this pooled collective knowledge or this collective basically research that's being done by helping people, but by understanding how what you're getting people to do is affecting their bodies. So, but I think, you know, the big premise today is underneath the method of science, there is this logical, rational appeal and use of first principles where we can all agree on. We have to find points of agreement before we can then layer on, you know, where we disagree. And I think that's important. It's not, you know, these things all require context. Instagram has zero context, right? So we need to get back to having like in-person conversations instead of arguing online. But knowing that we each have a responsibility to apply the scientific method in whatever, you know, layer of depth that is, to making sure that acquiring knowledge or putting knowledge out there is actually reflecting the truth and not just something that you want to spread out there, whether your motive is selling something or whatever.
It's almost energy draining for me to even look at some of the argument threads going back and forth with
it's
people
toxic sometimes.
hurling, but even people who are like clinicians in our field. I've seen posts where they're hurling research studies back and forth at each other over the course of sometimes days, where it's like, each hour and it's like, oh my God, like this could have been cleared up face to face probably within an hour. And again, that's maybe not reasonable, but if these people talked it out in still on the internet, they could even just call each other, like FaceTime each other or something, and be like, hey, it's this weird thing where it's like a showy thing too. Yeah. So like, it's like, well, why would we do that? We want to show people, right? So we want to put it we want to put it out there. But if they could even film that, but it's like, hey, instead of going back and forth in comments with like huge paragraphs for 2 days long, why don't we go on FaceTime and talk for an hour, and then we can still put that online? Why don't we do that more? Yeah. And I think it's just...
And have a logical conversation, right? Like these... I think the art of debate, the art of like having a logical, rational conversation where it's okay that you disagree, but respecting each other to the point where you're both being unemotional about this. And I think that's the problem, is most people are trying to defend an ideology where they have a personal connection to what they're trying to prove. And so when you put out a statement that's disproving something, they basically interpret it as a personal attack. And then they try and use these basically like cheap shots to try and hack away at your position because they're feeling vulnerable, that their personal identity is being challenged. And that's not, this is a very unhealthy way to have discussions and discover the truth, right? And I really think that's a big part of the problem, is people just have lost. You look at a platform like Joe Rogan, where people have 3-hour conversations to really air out a topic and put it through the rigor. Joe's a very good interviewer, right? He's a good bullshit detective, and I think that's a powerful medium for having the conversations that we need to have, because it's like this lack of context, little snippets of information jabbing at each other through the matrix on social media is a terrible way, especially when you see health professionals doing it. Like, it's really not, that's not cool. That's not appropriate, right?
And then it confuses everybody.
Exactly.
Who's looking at it. Exactly.
And so we need to all agree on the principles of science. We need to be stewards of applying those principles. If you're in a position of teaching others stuff or helping others as health professionals, you really need to pay some attention to the method of science, and just making sure that what you're saying has gone through that filter, and as time goes on, increasing the effectiveness of your filter, right? Like, you should always be, in order to discover the truth, you need to be better at understanding how to evaluate objectively whether something is true or not. And like we said before, in the world of health, you have a body. You can test everything that people say on yourself to get your own version of whether that holds up. Because like you said, if 1,000 articles say eat this and you shit your pants every time you eat it, this is probably not a good thing to listen to. So just use, common sense is not that common, unfortunately, but I think hopefully podcasts like this help people feel empowered, that they have the ability to evaluate information they receive and are not just passive recipients of quote unquote science or journal articles. They're receiving the information, but then they have their own filter system to put it through to determine whether or not it's something they should tell other people or implement themselves. So anyway, we hope you enjoyed that podcast and it helped to kind of clear the air on science. I'm sure there will be follow-up podcasts on this topic. But yeah, have a great day.